Why, hello there, back like I never left. I apologize for my week and a half to 2 week hiatus. Sometimes a full week of traveling for work just coincides and leads up to your first ever finals week for grad school. So, bit of a delirious state coming off of that. But I wanted today to make my long-awaited return to talk about pretty much the only book I've been able to read for like the past month. And that is, of course, Stephen King's Dreamcatcher. Such an interesting book. A lot of things to talk about with this book. Very interesting one from Stephen King. As per usual, with the book reviews, with talking about the books, I'm gonna run through a bit of a setup for it. Maybe you want to try it on your own, do a little bit of a taste test. I don't know, but that'll be spoiler free. Then I'll get into some spoiler sections, things I liked, things I didn't exactly like, come to some sort of decision on whether I would recommend it or not, and maybe, if possible, get into some Dark Tower King multiverse connections within the book itself. I just have to. This is probably the worst cover in all of Stephen King's collection. He has a lot of great ones, a lot of so-so ones, but this one, man, that like late 90s into early 2000s, that Y2K cover design game was slacking so hard, and this is just, it's not one of those hardbacks that I'm proud to own, proud to display. It's just like a very low-res pixely mess. And not the biggest fan of it. There are deer on it. There really aren't deer involved in this book, so I don't really get it, but so it goes. So I knew a little bit of the backstory going into reading this book, which didn't give me a ton of hope, because part of that backstory is maybe you're like me. As soon as you start to like an author or like a person, a writer, a director, whatever it may be, you immediately have to know every single thing about them. So as I developed my love for King in high school and through college, I got my hands on any article, any interview, any piece of advice, anything around Stephen King that I possibly could. And I knew going into this book that he didn't exactly love, in hindsight, Dreamcatcher, which was like great. One of my favorite authors. I'm about to read this book by him, and I know that in hindsight, he is not a fan of it at all. So what are the chances that I'm going to like it? And part of the backstory when it comes to this book is that, if you didn't know, Stephen King got in a really, really bad, traumatic, like near-death experience type of automobile accident where he was walking on the side of a road. He was struck by a vehicle, and he took a very, very long time to recover from those very, very serious near-fatal injuries. And this book was written during his recovery process. He handwrote it. Gotcha. He handwrote it in cursive during that recovery process, and it later came out that he pretty much did the entirety of it like in a delirious state under the influence of painkillers that were there to obviously help him combat his injuries while he was in the hospital. But yeah, I think he's talked about like not remembering a ton of the process of writing this book. It's a horror novel. It includes things like body horror, very briefly, I would say, sort of like Nick Cutter-esque, or I guess you would say Nick Cutter was emulating some of the things going on in this novel. Alien-y, alien invasion things are occurring here, as well as just some like general science fiction based horror. That's the kind of thing we're dealing with. I think Stephen King really liked the idea of apocalyptic fiction at this time, because I just read Cell. Cell was about a cell phone based apocalypse. This is about a like disease fungus-based apocalypse, which again, very timely considering all the apocalyptic mushroom-related things with like The Last of Us, for instance. This is all about an apocalypse, or at least a disease that threatens to cause an apocalypse, rather, all a result of this sort of like fungus that is developing. And essentially, the basis for this book is that it is about 4 New England friends, and it sort of traces their friendship from its origin when they are children all the way up to adulthood. And these 4 friends save this one kid who is a little older than them when they are teenagers, and that kid just so happens to have Down syndrome from, they save this kid from a group of bullies, right? And in their developed friendship with him, his name is Duddits. They acquire this power that he happens to have, which has to do with telepathy. They have shared dreams with him. They have this general connection with him once they develop this friendship that lasts all throughout their lives from childhood to adulthood and leads them down an interesting path. When on a cabin trip, these four friends get together. Duddits, their friend, is absent from it, so it's just the four of them, and a bunch of weird things in the middle of the New England, Maine woods start to happen on this cabin hunting trip. They come across this strange figure, or rather multiple figures, who seem to be infected by this virus that is sort of covering them in these weird red spores, and they, like, some of the symptoms seem to be that they pass gas a lot, which is an interesting inclusion, and it feels very sort of alien, you know, with sort of like a parasite growing inside of them, this sort of like parasitic existence of this spore mushroom based thing that's infecting them that causes a whole number of different issues and also causes this sort of like shared telepathy. So there's a lot of weird things going on with this infection that is spreading pretty rapidly at times, unexplainably not spreading at all among other people, and the government gets involved, tries to keep it all hush hush. So it's sort of this back and forth narrative between this group of four friends who already share these powers, who are on this hunting trip, and they encounter this disease-ridden man who sort of reveals this parasitic disease that is developing. Then it shifts to the government, the military, and this pretty insane group that is, again, trying to keep everything a secret, keep it hush-hush, just miles away from their cabin trip. And it's a pretty long book, and it just kind of goes back and forth between them. It's a bit of cat and mouse as well between military group that is trying to keep things hush-hush and the friend group who's just trying to survive this terrifying encounter that they never expected to happen on their annual friends hunting trip. So that's my extended, hopefully spoilerless spiel on Dreamcatcher. And if it sounds like something you would enjoy, I encourage you to check out. If you need some like King comparisons, I would say it is similar to most like apocalyptic based things that he has written that involves four friends. There are visits to Derry, Maine, and there's some other familiar elements from past King books. It feels like the Tommyknockers mixed with it, but not like the good parts of it. And that it's mostly Tommyknockers, which is a book by King that I also really don't like. So not the most glowing endorsement there, but if you like the Tommyknockers and you like books that are about lifelong groups of friends, then hey, this one may very well be for you. So let's get into some of my likes, some of my dislikes. Some of my likes. I enjoy a setting like this. I like cabin in the woods based books, and when they are labeled as horror, labeled as spooky, chances are I'm going to be a pretty big fan of them. But this book seemed to really focus on that for a minimal amount of time. I thought this was going to be much more like permanently based, almost like in an Evil Dead sort of manner once they welcomed this disease-ridden man into their cabin, that it would be like sort of like centrally focused on their friendship and things going on within this cabin. That's kind of what I thought this was going to be. I didn't know a ton about the book. I didn't even read the blurb or the synopsis on the back. Blindly, that's just kind of what I thought it would be about. Really wasn't that at all. This is much more so another pretty broad scope, massively scaled, at least in terms of like the potential effect, the ramifications of the way that this disease could potentially spread, as fueled by the sort of like antagonist's goal of this, like a disease-infected person trying to spread this disease to everybody in Maine and eventually like the world, and everyone would turn into these sort of like alien invaders that have come to sort of spread this disease. It was fine. You know, it was fine. It wasn't exactly what I hoped for, especially coming off of Cell, which was another very sort of apocalyptic, dystopian sort of exploration from King. Didn't feel that fresh with Dreamcatcher coming off that book, but maybe that's my fault for, you know, reading them back to back. Regardless, I kind of liked the cabin in the woods setting, didn't like the way it ultimately developed. And I don't know if I'm just like not a big fan of alien invasion horror. I have never really loved it. I find it fun at times, but the way King has treated it with something like Tommyknockers, I just really haven't enjoyed it. And again, I don't know if that is like a singularly Stephen King thing that I don't enjoy, the way he treats alien invasions, or if it's just like my general distaste for alien fiction, but I just really didn't love that part of it. I didn't love the sort of like military group that was involved in this. There were just a bunch of things that I didn't absolutely hate, but there was nothing that was really gripping me and like keeping me glued to the page constantly reading. It took me weeks to read this book. Usually it takes me a matter of days to finish a Stephen King book. So that's probably another indication of how I felt about this. And I don't know, I definitely like the references to past King books. I like when he is sort of aware and includes that sort of intertextual connection between, characters, settings, between, his other books, but it didn't feel strong enough. It just felt sort of geographically by happenstance. Things like Derry, Maine, things like Pennywise and the Losers Club were being mentioned here, didn't really play any sort of significant role. It just kind of felt like it was mentioned because in proximity, that's where this new group of friends were sort of on their cabin trip. And the sort of culmination of this book leads you to Derry, Maine, to the standpipe, to the sewers, because alien invaders are trying to spread this disease through the water lines. And that's sort of as far as it goes in terms of that connection. In terms of my dislikes, I feel like I've kind of filtered through them, by proxy of discussing some of my likes, but why they weren't fully likes, if you know what I mean. There wasn't anything about this book that really kept me hooked. The premise itself was promising, sort of superficially, but I don't think it delivered that well. And it seems like at least this like 90s, mid-90s to early 2000s version of Stephen King feels some need to include a diverse set of characters, which on its face is a good idea. You should have diverse representation in your fiction, in your books, but he does it in a really weird way, especially so in the Regulators and in this, where he includes characters who, for instance, one of the main characters in this book has Down syndrome. One of the main characters in the Regulators has autism. And in the Regulators, the child with autism happens to be this holder of immense power, and it's not like positive power. It's almost, I wouldn't say like making him a villain because of his autism, but it is a sort of strange move and sort of root of the power that is used from like the antagonist's point of view in the Regulators, and it's used in a different way in this book. But the fact that the character has Down syndrome, it feels like it's sort of like a token inclusion of diversity. It just feels like this kid happens to have Down syndrome, but all of this baggage comes along with that. And I listened to part of the audiobook, and the narrator was trying to like imitate this character who had Down syndrome with his voice, and it felt really, it felt like it lacked any taste. It felt really just dirty and not great the way they represented a man with Down syndrome in this book. And there were parts that were very touching, very emotional, but some of it just didn't feel right, and I was just constantly distracted by it. Like, I feel like in order to achieve a very organic, diverse representation, it should reflect the real world in a very diverse way. And all of the different elements that came along with this Duddits character having Down syndrome, it felt like Stephen King was like, see, I can include diverse characters. And by the way, he has all these weird, strange, unexplainable things about him that are going to come along with who he is as a character. And part of it didn't feel right to me, but I don't know. Tell me if I'm wrong about that. Tell me how you felt about it. If you read this book, if I were to rate it out of 10, I'd give it like a 6.4. The last thing I like to do with these Stephen King reviews is touch on, mention any potential sort of Dark Tower connections that may have been in there. As you know, if you've kept up with this channel for a long time, you know that I'm a fan of Stephen King's Dark Tower series, and that a lot of elements in other Stephen King books usually connect back to the Dark Tower in some way. In some way, every book in the Stephen King backlog in this multiverse are connected by some sort of thread. Sometimes it's a very thick thread that's tied very tightly. Sometimes it's a kind of loose, very thin thread. So let's talk about what that looked like in Dreamcatcher. Part of this book, it's a pretty dynamic setting from about a quarter to a third of the way through the book, especially in terms of the way it sort of goes back and forth with flashbacks and sort of the present timeline. We visit Bridgeton, Maine, which is one of the main settings in Stephen King's Dark Tower Book 6, Song of Susanna. So it was cool to revisit a location from a book I've already read with that book. There's a pharmacy in Bridgeton mentioned in Song of Susanna, Dark Tower Book 6. That is also mentioned, and a site of visitation in Dreamcatcher. In addition to that, of course, Salem's Lot, Jerusalem's Lot is sort of mentioned in passing when it comes to sort of like the traveling section of this book, as there's this, again, sort of cat and mouse chase going on the highway in the middle of this snowstorm. Again, nothing takes place in Salem's Lot in Dreamcatcher, but they happen to like pass the exit for Salem's Lot when they are on this highway, and it's just mentioned like once. And then finally, everything is sort of leading back to Derry, and Derry is mentioned quite a bit, all of the history of Derry with these missing children, with all the sort of tragedies that came about with this massive storm that sort of culminates at the end of Stephen King's It, with the battle between the Losers Club and what we know as the Crimson King sort of parading around as Pennywise in it. Pennywise is mentioned. There's graffiti alluding to Pennywise and the Losers Club and all this different things that happen. That sort of reference was probably my favorite when it came to Dark Tower connections in this book. But beyond that, that's pretty much everything in terms of Dark Tower connections. Nothing really direct outside of some mentioning of settings and of Pennywise. So yeah, that's everything in terms of those connections, and that's sort of my thoughts on this book. Not a ton of depth to them because I really didn't get a lot out of this book. I'm interested to see where King's work goes from this. I've officially finished everything by King from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. So on I go to the 2010s. Have you read Dreamcatcher? Did you enjoy this book? Let me know your thoughts on it, good and bad, down in the comments below. And other than that, we'll catch up next time. Peace.